This is the Unsure Podcast, the podcast about religion, atheism, and everything in between.
Welcome, dear listeners, to another enlightening episode of the Unsure Podcast. Today is a particularly special day as we have the honour of hosting our first overseas guest, the fascinating Neel Ingman from the picturesque landscapes of New Zealand. Neel's life journey is as diverse as the topics he explores on his website, neelingman.com. That's NEELINGMAN.com. And his thought-provoking books available on Amazon. You'll also find him on Twitter, or X as we might call it one day, and YouTube. This global citizen has traversed the world, wearing many hats along the way, from driving lorries in the UK to working on construction sites in Germany. Trying his hand at screenwriting in the US, Neel has accumulated a wealth of experiences that shape his unique perspective on religious matters. Now retired in the serene beauty of New Zealand, Neel dedicates his time to writing about religious issues, offering profound insights that challenge conventional beliefs. His work focuses on refuting the intelligent design argument, providing a compelling counter-argument that delves into the concept of bad design in the natural world. What sets Neel apart is not just his diverse life experiences, but also his daring exploration of the afterlife. He shares his own so-called near-death experience and backs his beliefs with an intriguing offer: a $5 million prize on his website for anyone who can present convincing proof of the afterlife. On neelingman.com, you'll find his critiques of the Pope's word salad tweets, his imagined conversations with God, and his polemics into scandals involving the Catholic Church. Neel Ingman is a voice that challenges, questions, and stimulates contemplation, and we're thrilled to have him join us on the Unsure Podcast. Get ready for a thought-provoking conversation that transcends borders and delves into the intriguing intersections of religion, life, and the afterlife. Stay tuned. Good morning, Neel. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Robert. Thanks very much for that glowing introduction. I was blushing just a little bit, but very nice to hear all that stuff.
What we usually do on the podcast is get a little bit of a kind of potted history of your background, and in particular, your exposure to religion. So, were you brought up in a religious household?
Yes. How religious, I'm not quite sure, because it was, let's say, my parents took me to church every week when I was young. As I got older, it sort of tapered off a little bit, and I think they were, part of the sort of thing of, we'd better do the right thing. Whether either of them were very strong believers, I'm not sure, although my father was on the local church committee, for, just running the, the financial side of things with regards to church properties and stuff. But I do remember very early on sitting in church and being told that, the omniscient God, he can read your thoughts. Trigger warning coming up, but perhaps I should have put a trigger warning right at the beginning. But I was sitting in church as about an 8-year-old or something like that, and like the word fuck or shit would pop into my brain. I'd say, don't shout it, don't say it. And the temptation to sort of shout it out because it was so naughty was quite strong. And so I'm sitting there in kind of fear and then thinking, no, don't shout it out. Oh, hang on, don't even think it because he can read your thoughts as well. Stop thinking that word. And yeah, which is kind of crazy. Anyway, it probably wasn't quite as dramatic as that sounds, but nevertheless, so there was that sort of thing. But as time went on, it's not as if I was a real believer and then suddenly stopped. It just kind of faded, and I think it faded with the, by the time I went away to university, my mother said, "Oh, well, please at least try to go to church on Easter and Christmas." This was, so it was, and I say, "Yeah, I'll try," but I'd long stopped going.
Okay. So when you were young, you were attending church, but perhaps your heart wasn't in it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, I think so. You see, this is what makes it so hard to remember when you're very, very young. the thoughts just sort of fade away. But I'm, because I can sort of remember that thought of, don't think the rude words, don't think the rude words. I was obviously believing it at that stage because we are even more gullible as children than we are as adults, obviously. So I sort of believed it for a while, but I don't remember any moment thinking, hang on, I don't believe that anymore. It just kind of faded away. But then I probably then went from there, sometime in my, early to late teens or whatever of having it fade away to just actually never giving it a thought for a few decades until it slowly came to my attention, the amount of damage that religion caused in the world. And the more I looked into it, the more I became to realize that, all the wars, all the strife, all the trouble was, well, not all, but a heck of a lot of it was because of religion. And so it became sort of slightly important for me to think that I should speak out against it.
So when did you start this speaking out against religion?
Within the last 10 years.
Right, but you had quite a varied work history before this venture into active atheism.
Yeah, I did. I spent a bit of time in Britain driving trucks and things like that. And, we do the thing from New Zealand called going for your OE, your overseas experience, where, a huge proportion of New Zealanders in their late teens, early 20s, travel to Europe and, spend a year or two doing that before coming home and kind of trying to get sensible about their lives.
Yeah.
I did those sort of things. When I finally came back, I got into a few things like when you first arrive back, think, God, what am I going to do now? So, I did a few jobs doing like car salesman, telephone system salesman, various things. But I ended up, I always kind of thought that I'd quite like to be a writer. And the first thing I thought that I'd really quite like to write is movies. So I did a bit of study into what it takes to write a screenplay and had a few goes at that. And the early versions were not very good, obviously. We never are the first times we do things. But I've eventually managed to start picking up a few jobs and working in television here in New Zealand, which I did for about 20 years, which was good fun. It's terrific, but it also is, while you're working, the pay is good and the conditions are good and stuff, but between jobs, you always wonder, well, when's my next paycheck coming? So it's
Sure.
Kind of a precarious way to make a living.
So when you retired from working life, you decided to devote your time to being quite outspoken on religious matters.
Well, it was, sort of more of a hobby than anything else, more than sort of deciding. It's not really, I don't see it as a crusade, or I'm not particularly driven that way, but I do find it quite interesting. And the interest, that I found in it, and that's kind of like my take on the religion thing is rather than having a serious conversation, Twitter's full of these, the arguments of Christians versus atheists and, firing shots back and forth at each other. And I indulged in that for a little while before I realised, it's just silly. It's just a waste of time. You're never going to convince anyone thing. And I think my main take on it is, with my books and everything else, is it's meant to be amusing, because I sort of think, even though religion is a serious problem and they do a lot of damage, I think the most fun way to attack them is just with ridicule. And I think, the closer that you look at the Bible, the closer that you look at religion, it is, if you step back, if you're not one of the faithful, it is just ridiculous. And you might as well ridicule it because it's a bit of fun. You can have a few laughs, and it's, I can make myself laugh while I'm just writing about it if I decide to take that approach. People say, you've got to respect someone else's religion. And you sort of go, look, I'll respect your right to believe anything you like, but you can't insist that I respect your religion if it strikes me as being just completely ridiculous. And this sort of idea of, oh no, you must respect religion, that is, to avoid the ridicule thing. Now, the thing about ridicule and things being ridiculous is it's in the word itself. If something, you can't ridicule something that is not in itself ridiculous. So, say you've got a football team that wins the their particular championship or league or whatever 3 years in a row. Now, you can't really ridicule that. Ha, ha, ha. Oh, yeah, keep on winning. That's not ridiculous. However, if they'd spent $150 million on new players and finished last in their league,
Sure.
that would be ridiculous, and they would be widely ridiculed. So the sort of thing that I would say to people say, oh, you mustn't ridicule my religion, is say, well, it is ridiculous. I'm sorry. I wouldn't be able to ridicule it if it were not ridiculous.
Understand that reasoning. And a lot of your work, and there are a number of your books on Amazon, and this is, I guess, going away from organised religion and more towards the arguments for God's existence, is that you're very focused on the intelligent design argument for God's existence.
Yeah. Well, it just seemed to be one that I thought was an easier way to attack it, if you know what I mean. It's
an easy target.
Yeah, because you say, okay, we were all perfectly designed by the perfect designer, and it's really wonderful. But then you see guys like, I think, Ken Ham. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I am, yes. He's creationist.
Yeah. And I think and I'm sure he had something to do with that ridiculous arc experience thing that they've got. But anyway, so you've got guys like him saying, this is perfect God's design. And one of the examples they use is that the human eye is far too complex to have arrived by evolution. Now, the guy saying this is wearing glasses. And you sort of go, yeah, look, you might have a good argument if it wasn't for the fact that, if someone with 20/20 vision as a child, by the time they're in their mid-40s, they start requiring reading glasses to read. What's such a perfect design about that? It's if you that's like having a car that once it's done 30,000 miles just breaks down unless you put a new engine in it. It's not a brilliant design. And the other things that are really obvious are the combination, the fact that we have our breathing tubes and our eating tubes, inside the same orifice, inside our mouths, and people choke to death all the time. Now, it would be pretty easy to have designed that so that one tube the eating tube just went into the mouth, and the breathing tube just used the nostrils only. Like dolphins. Dolphins can't breathe through their mouths. They can only breathe through their breathing, through their blowholes.
And as a result, dolphins don't choke to death.
They can never choke to death. Doesn't matter what they get stuck in their throat. They can't choke to death because they're different things. And our digestive system, it's really inefficient. Every day we produce, waste that is, disgusting and, needs to be disposed of. And we've had to develop whole plumbing systems in our house just because our system is not very efficient at processing the food that we put in it. If it was really efficient, it could process the food that we put in, and the only waste would be possibly, liquid or, gaseous. We'd just exhale it. That would be a good piece of design. We'd never have to worry about going to the toilet at all. And, why couldn't you design something like that? But, if you're God, you should have been able to design that.
It always irks me as well when creationists suggest that people who promote evolutionary theory have some sort of agenda.
Yeah. Yeah, what is it?
Well, the agenda that they imply is that they're, sort of heathens that want to get rid of the need for a god, that they're all kind of conspiring with each other.
My general take on it is science works, and scientists aren't just making stuff up. Science observes things, does experiments to prove that the observations are correct, and comes to a conclusion that says this is the fact of what it is, rather than just making up a thing like, well, God did it. Well, that doesn't actually explain anything. This is what they're so annoyed about, because evolution does, in fact, go quite a long way to proving that, God, the designer, the creator of humans, isn't a thing. And so that's why they have to fight so hard about it. But even if you leave evolution out of the argument, there's still plenty of, I'd not say there's still not plenty of evidence that God doesn't exist, because there's never plenty of evidence that anything doesn't exist. You can't prove something doesn't exist, really. But the fact that there has never, ever been a piece of evidence that proves that God does exist. And I think the reason that it's clear enough to say that is something had occurred that actually proved, and I'm not saying was a sign or I had voices in my head or something like that, but something that actually proved the existence of God. We'd have all heard about it. It would be the biggest news event of all time. There'd be no more argument. I'd say, okay, you got me. That's real. Now, I'm just to give an extreme example of what God could do, because remember, God, even though God in the Bible, does lots of things that are well beneath the powers of an omnipotent being or creature or whatever. Let's say that the sky turned glowing red one day, and in big gold letters, came up, "I am God." He could make himself a picture of whatever, and the big noises and the trumpets came out of the sky, and everybody walked out of the street. This is all over the world simultaneously, whether it was day or night. Suddenly, you're getting this message, and it's saying to you in your own language, of course, because that's what you can understand, I am God, I'm the real God, I'm the one of the commandments, you must have no other God but me, you must bow down to me and stuff. And then you go back inside and you turn on your computer, and it's on your computer screen as well. You turn on television, it's the only thing on the news, because this has happened to everybody simultaneously all around the world. Now, God should have the power to be able to do something like that, but no, nothing that could only be the work of God has ever happened. Otherwise, we would have heard about it.
I heard someone make the argument recently that if there was an omniscient, omnipotent, all-powerful God, there would be heaps and heaps of evidence for him.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, because he couldn't help but impose himself. And this gets back to what he said in the 10 Commandments. The first 4 of the 10 Commandments are all commanding humanity that we bow down to him and praise him. Now, these are meant to be the first 4 rules that are the most important things for humans to live by. You must praise me. You must praise me. You must make no graven images. You must not blaspheme. And you must take one day a week totally devoted to worshipping him. Now, if he wanted that to happen, as he says, as he takes the first 4 commandments to do, and yet on planet Earth, what's the percentage of people that believe in that particular God?
The God of Abraham, it's going to be over half, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, but okay, let's just say if we're half, let's just call it half for argument's sake. What about the other half? Why doesn't he appear to them and just say, "Hey, look, I've given you the orders, shake yourself up," but he never appears to them. He never appears to them. He never, for people like you and I who are denying his existence entirely, he never strikes us down dead. He doesn't do anything to defend himself. He never defends himself. And yet, he is supposed to be all-powerful and demands that we bow down to him and praise him. And yet, when we don't, when we can flip him the bird and just say, "Nah, you just don't even exist," what's his response? Nothing.
Sure. And on the podcast, when I do speak to believers, I do pose that question to them. Surely there would be more tangible, irrefutable evidence for God's existence. And I get a variety of answers, and some are more persuasive than others.
Yeah, what's a persuasive one? I've never heard one.
A lot of the responses seem to say that faith is a virtue that we need to have.
Oh, okay.
And almost the sort of suggestion that, if God provided us with the evidence for his existence, then we'd all be robots. That faith is an important part of the mix, and you can't have faith about something about which there's 100% proof.
Yeah, but I don't think, God in the first 4 commandments, he never mentioned at any stage, "And you have to have faith because I'm never going to show myself to you." In fact, in the Bible, he does show himself to humans. He came down on Mount Sinai with a couple of big rocks with the commandments carved in them and gave them to Moses. He was not shy of the Bible, but he's been shy ever since. Their argument there is actually, no, the lack of proof is the proof, which is just absurd.
Going back to your exploration of the intelligent design argument, do your counter-arguments focus more on the human body, or is there an explanation of the natural world and the environment and so on?
Well, there are 3 books in the series. The first one is Not Very Intelligent Design, and that does exactly that. That basically examines every part of the human body. It starts at the top, looks at hair, things like, why do we need haircuts all the time? When you look at a short-haired cat, it's got a perfect haircut. It's the right length around its mouth, around its eyes, around its ears. Exactly the right length, that hair. They never need a haircut. I'd love that. That'd be bloody brilliant. And so it starts from there and it goes right down. Eyes, ears, nose, mouth, it goes through every part of the body. So it lists through those and basically shows that pretty much every single part of the human body could be designed, could be improved with slightly better design. Now, so that's the human body part of it. The second book is called Not Very Intelligent Design 2, Planet Earth, and this examines that people say, okay, well, God gave us this wonderful planet to live on, and it's perfect, it's in the Goldilocks zone, it's the Goldilocks thing, but when you look at, and it is in the Goldilocks zone in terms of the place in space, because we have, most of the world exists in what we really need for existence, like human existence, is temperatures where, water is liquid rather than ice or vapor, gas. And so, but then when you look at planet Earth, you say, if this was really made for humans, how come fish get 70% of it? And fish not only get 70% of the Earth, their environment's actually much more pleasant than ours. They never get hurricanes, windstorms, they never get rain, they never get, the terrible weather events that we get up here. They just need to maybe, swim a little bit deeper if the water's a bit choppy. And wherever they live, fish will either be tropical fish or they'll be, fish that live in the colder parts. But where they live, their own habitat only changes about 4 or 5 degrees year round. It's their environment is much better than the human's environment. And then when we look at the rest of planet Earth, so 70% of it's that. Of the 30% left, most of that still can't be inhabited by humans because...
Sure, deserts and stuff like that.
Yeah, 20% of it's covered with snow and ice, 20% of it's mountains. They're, deserts, as you say, land with no topsoil. In fact, the fertile land is only 30% of the actual land area. In other words, the bit that God allocated to us is just 30% of that 30%. So it's about 9% of the surface area of the planet is, and in fact, it's a lot less than that when then you go back and consider, right, where would be really good for humans to live, considering, you've got at any given time on the planet, there are war zones and there are zones where people are dying of starvation and all that sort of stuff. It comes down to a tiny percentage of the Earth that is actually really good. So you'd think a God, instead of making a planet where, think maybe 3 or 4% is perfect for human habitation, could have maybe given us 50%, possibly, if that's what it was designed for. So, yeah. And then the third book, which has only just sort of come out now, it's called Not Very Intelligent Design 3, God and the Human Brain, and it analyzes whether, in fact, the human brain is the creation of God or whether God is the creation of the human brain.
Sure.
And it basically analyzes all sorts of things about, how good is this brain as a design, because as we know, a lot of people aren't very nice. We've got a lot of psychopaths, and then there's a lot of, mental illness. There's a lot of things that are not perfect about the human brain. And so it goes into a bit of that. And of course, they go off into silly stories about all sorts of things because, it's there for entertainment rather than getting too serious about it.
I know you'll agree with this, that people who put forward the design argument as an argument for God's existence are very selective with their evidence.
Oh, yeah, extremely so. Yeah, I mean, the hoops they have to jump through with Ken Ham and the Ark encounter thing, trying to build that ark to demonstrate that story was true in the Bible. Because I believe I just saw a thing the other day on it. There's a part in there that shows where the dinosaurs were on the ark.
Wow.
And the whole ark story is just so absolutely ludicrous unless God actually gave all the animals a shot of what's that new drug that stops you eating. People are using it for weight loss.
So no cocaine?
Yeah, it could be. But there's this huge way they give you an injection sort of every month or something, and Oprah Winfrey was using it. They'd need to give that to all the animals on the ark to stop them eating each other during the course of the journey. Anyway, it's too ridiculous for words, that whole ark business.
Yeah, well, I will be speaking to someone on the podcast who believes that the Ark story is historical fact.
Could I have a question for them?
Yeah, by all means. But an argument that they make is that, well, if God is omnipotent, then all of this is possible. So, when you come up with the counter arguments that you couldn't fit all of these animals on, and where would you store the food and so on, the retort is, well, God's all powerful, therefore he can make it happen.
Yeah, and I'd say if God, because his reason for doing this was, he looked down on mankind and he was disappointed with his creation and he needed to wipe them out and start again. If he was that guy, he could have snapped his fingers and made it disappear.
Yeah, he could have changed everything in an instant.
Yeah, but instead, according to this story, he chose to get a 900-year-old man to build a boat and then drown everybody, to put all the humans he'd created, all the animals he'd created, through the horror of drowning in a huge flood. He chose that instead of just clicking his fingers and making them disappear.
Sure.
What sort of a sadist would do that? You're a psychopath.
Okay, so moving on. I was intrigued on your website by your exploration of life after death, and I'm intrigued to hear about your near-death experience or lack thereof.
Right. I had a health problem about 2 years ago, I suppose, 2 or 3 years ago, where I had ended up with a lot of gallstones, so I had to go in the hospital and have my gallbladder taken out. And when you get an anaesthetic like that, what do they call it? The total anaesthetic? No, the opposite of a local anaesthetic, the full anaesthetic.
General
anaesthetic. That's the word I'm looking for. Mm. When you get a general anaesthetic, they sort of say count down. You get this lovely rush of warmth going through your veins, and then boom, you're out, and then bam, immediately they're waking you up in a different room, and nothing occurred during that time, not even time. I mean, there was no dreaming, there was no, when you wake up after you've been asleep, quite often figure out, it's probably about 7:30, it's probably about 8 o'clock. And most of the time, you're within a pretty good thing, because somehow you've been aware and your brain's been as busy as anything. You've been dreaming all night, you've been doing all sorts of other stuff. But under a general anaesthetic, bam, you're just out, gone, dead, effectively, brain dead. Your brain's not doing anything in that time. It's not registering anything.
Sure.
And that's why it seems like no time has passed. It's just bang, you're out, and click, you're awake again. And I sort of figure that's probably what it's like to be dead, because the other thing that goes with that is, remember, we've all been dead before. We were all effectively dead before we were born. For millions of years, we didn't exist. There was nothing going on. It was just nothing. And then when we die, once again, I think it points to the fact that it will once again be nothing. There's no reason to assume that, there'll be this afterlife, there'll be this heaven, because where did that come from? There's no evidence for it whatsoever. It's just something that someone made up. And then a lot of people, choose to believe it. It's a thing that Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Sapiens, I think he identified the idea that the greatest difference we have from other animals is that we have the ability to communicate quite complex ideas with each other. And we can make stuff up and tell other people about it, but it's also our greatest problem because other people might believe it even when it's just not true. And, you can tell someone a story and they say, oh, yeah, but is that true? You go, no, it was too silly for words. I just made it up. Couldn't you tell I just made it? Oh, well, I didn't know. And this is why people get away with making up a story about, and there's this place called heaven and it's got harps and angels and clouds and stuff. Well, someone just made that up. And people choose to believe it. There's no evidence at all, ever, and never has been, that such a thing as the afterlife exists. The only reason that it exists is because it is what organized religion sells to you in return for the money you give them. That's the deal. They are selling you basically not life insurance, but death insurance. You're going to get your payout after you're dead, and it's going to be brilliant, and it's going to be everything you can imagine. It's going to be it's going to be heaven. It's going to be wonderful. But there's no proof that it exists.
I think that possibly the belief in the afterlife stems from human beings' death anxiety, I think. And that's where it came from. And I don't know, do animals have a concept of death?
Yeah, who knows? Who knows? It'd be hard to say. Well, I sort of think they probably do because, occasionally, they get to, if you're in Africa, they'd get to watch one of their group, one of their tribe get ripped to bits and eaten by something else. And also they do that, things like crows and elephants, they sort of hold wakes, don't they, when one of their number dies. They kind of stand around and basically have a funeral for them. So they have some understanding of it, I believe, of the death thing, but they certainly wouldn't believe in an afterlife, I don't think.
So going back to near-death experiences, I'll level with you and say that I find their testimonies believable in that they're not lying when they explain what they experience, all of the things about lights and tunnels and all sorts of stuff like that. Do you think people are making it up, or do you think...
No. I agree with you. I think they're telling the truth, but what is happening is, they are in a state where their brain is doing all that stuff, but it's like all the things they've described. It's sort of like I don't know if you've ever tried LSD or...
No comment.
No comment. Okay, fine. I don't do it anymore. Or something like nitrous oxide, which is those little. They got a bit popular with kids quite a few years ago. They're the little whipped cream canisters. So you inhale one of those things, and your brain just goes haywire with lights and noises and so your brain can create all that stuff, and it might have, and there might be a certain part of the thing, when your body's shutting down to a certain extent, that it feels like the tunnel of light, and it feels like that. But much wilder things can, be drug induced. So brains can do all that sort of stuff. But, when someone's hooked up to the machines, you can see, right, at this moment, they're dead. They're not, nothing's going on anymore there. Mm-hmm. And it's in the definition of, the word death, isn't it? It's
absence of light.
It's the permanent cessation of vital functions. Yeah. Now, if you've been dead, in the hospital, for a minute, which happens, and then doop, 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 you start to come alive again, and in that time your brain has given you these sort of things, the fact that the cessation of vital functions wasn't permanent means you weren't dead, you were just unconscious, and your organs had shut down for a second or two, and then they started up again.
Two scientific arguments I've encountered, the lack of oxygen to the brain argument, isn't there? And also that I'm not sure how much truth there is in this, but someone suggested to me a few years ago that your brain is conscious of the fact that you're going to die, and as a result it releases some form of chemical that gives you all of these kind of joyful experiences. So your death is not a stressful event.
I find that one a bit harder to buy because how would your brain know that was going to happen, for one?
Well, I think people often know that they're going to die, don't they?
Oh, well, yeah. When you are in fact dying, you can tell you. Yeah, I was sort of thinking. I was thinking you were meaning that you weren't consciously aware that you were
Oh,
going to
no,
die.
you're conscious and your brain anticipates your death, and to make it less stressful, there is some sort of, I don't know, hallucinogenic drug or whatever, and it just makes your passing a little more peaceful and less stressful. And you have this dream where you meet Jesus or whatever, and then, bosh, you wake up and you've had a near-death experience.
Yeah, well, that might occur. Yeah.
So has anybody taken you up on the offer of your $5 million prize for proof of the afterlife?
Oh, I've had 3 or 4 approaches on it. The rules are pretty specific on my website if anybody's interested in having a go at it. Because what it basically says is you got to prove it, and for proof we'll use, because if you just say, well, I've proved it now, and I'll say, no, you haven't, then you've got to sue me in a court of law. So we'll just start in a court of law. And I've said in a secular court of law, because I wouldn't want to end up in the Bible Belt of the US where every single person's a Christian on the jury. I get hammered. But in a secular court of law, and I'm in New Zealand, so a New Zealand court of law, you sue me for that money, and what you'd have to do would have to be to prove in front of a secular jury beyond reasonable doubt that the afterlife exists. And there's no way you're going to do that,
Sure. If there's any listeners out there who want to claim their $5 million, do refer to Neel's website. I'm surprised, actually, you might have received it already. I'm surprised that no one has got in contact with you and said, oh, well, it says in the Bible, for the wages of sin is death, and whoever believes in me will have eternal life. That proves that the concept of the afterlife is true.
Well, this is what they say about the proof of the existence of God, isn't it? They say, prove that God exists. Well, it says so in the Bible. Well, yeah.
So what approaches have you had with regards to this offer?
The ones that you just have to kind of gently say, look, thanks for your interest, but, really, the arguments they're making are just so out there that you can't. And they're thinking that constitutes proof. Well, and I just say, look, honestly, you should read the terms and conditions of the challenge, and there is no point in even discussing it with me. You can if you want to, but under the terms and conditions, you have to sue me in court. And if you don't think you're going to win that court case, just don't even bother, because that's what the deal is. I think part of the reason that people, it's the fear of death that allows the church to exploit the concept of the afterlife and as a thing, as a nirvana that they could sell to people who are scared of what might happen when they die. And also with the threat, the carrot and stick thing, the stick is, and you'll go to hell if you don't. However, death is not, it's just part of the human condition. It's something we should not be scared of. When you think that death is going to be exactly the same as it was before you were born to after you were born, then there's nothing to worry about, because it will be.
You don't know you're dead, do you?
No, you won't know. You won't know anything. It'll be nothing. It'll not be hot or cold or bright or dark. It'll just be nothing. And the thing that we say at funeral services, all sorts, when somebody dies, is rest in peace. And now, what could be more peaceful than that non-existence? So it won't be peaceful going to heaven and finding out that the guy in charge of heaven is this same God that threatens you with eternal damnation if you don't behave. He's still in charge of heaven. Why is he going to suddenly change from being this narcissistic psychopath, with making up all these rules for people on earth and threatening them with all sorts of punishment, but suddenly you get to heaven and he's just going to be nice as pie and make everything good? Why is he going to change?
Well, I think the idea that many Christians come out with, that if you have been faithful to him over the course of your life, then, heaven will be paradise.
Yeah, because especially it's the Catholic one, isn't it? Provided you repent, provided you confess and repent, in time before you die, then, you can pretty much have done anything before then, which makes it all a bit silly.
Another thing on your website is your ire towards the Catholic Church. Did you have a Catholic upbringing?
No, I wasn't. I was raised in an Anglican household. I think probably my ire towards them started with a show that I saw, I think called Sex, Crimes and the Vatican. It came out, I think, in 2006. BBC 2006. People want to look it up. I don't know if you can find it on the internet. You probably can somewhere. Fantastic documentary. And this documentary showed that at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger, who, remember, he's the one that became Pope, the one that looked like an evil little pixie and retired, because I think he was worried that maybe his background would come out and that would be held against the church, because he spent 20 years as the chief enforcer of a thing called the Crimen Solicitationis, which is the secret 39-page Vatican instruction manual for maintaining the secrecy of sex offences in the church. And this guy became Pope. He was the guy for making sure that whenever they found out that one of their priests was raping children, they just kept a lid on it and moved that priest to another parish. And they've been doing this for decades and decades. Now, and the guy in charge of that can be elevated to the position of Pope. And so this was not what makes it, they sort of say, oh, we've got a couple of bad apples. No, you haven't. It's absolutely systemic. It's built into your organisation. And the other thing that strikes me about the Catholic Church is the absolute hypocrisy of these people. Every new revelation comes up, oh, now it's in South America, now it's in America, now it's in Ireland. And every new example comes up that, 20,000 children were raped in this country. And, the numbers are just staggering. And it was absolutely systemic as part of the Catholic Church. You realise how big of hypocrites they are because, whilst Ratzinger's doing this stuff of protecting them and shuffling them all around, they are preaching that there's an omniscient God who is watching over everything you do. Now, how could a priest who's raping a child in a church believe that God's watching? How could the bishop, who then decides to cover up that priest's crimes and just shift him to another place, do that if he believes that God's watching? You wouldn't do that if you believed that God was watching. You wouldn't do it. And that just shows what huge hypocrites they are. And the whole thing is just lie upon lie upon lie. It's just based on lies, nothing else.
If you were to recommend one resource, a book that somebody who is perhaps wavering in their belief about God, which publication would you point them to, apart from your own, of course?
Well, I think it's hard for me just off the top of my head to point to specific ones, but Christopher Hitchens is definitely my favourite. Pretty much any of his books, they're all well worth reading, all brilliant. I mean, he is very erudite and he's a great speaker. So I think also get on YouTube and just search for Christopher Hitchens and him having his debates with people, and you can't go past that. He is brilliant, and I've never seen him get even vaguely tongue-tied or lost for being absolutely on top of the reasons for things.
So thank you very much for joining me on the Unsure podcast today, Neel. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, so did I. Thank you very much for having me.
If you want to check out Neel's work, then you can visit his website, which is neelingman.com. That's NEELINGMAN.com. You can also follow him on Twitter or X, and his handle is @NeelIngman. That's again NEELINGMAN. Thanks again for joining me, Neel.
Thank you very much.